A restoration clause, which is sometimes called a dilapidations clause, can create significant financial liabilities for your company. So it's something you should pay close attention to when you're negotiating a lease. It's not uncommon for this clause to be ignored because people tend to focus on more important things like rental rate, lease term, and tenant improvements. However, when your lease term ends and it's time to vacate the premises, the restoration obligations can be expensive and complicated, so it's worthwhile to give it its due attention during your lease negotiation. You might think the landlord wants to keep that expensive build-out you did, but in many cases, they don't. A restoration clause obligates you, the tenant, to restore your space to its original condition, either completely or in part, when you move out, so it increases your cost and decreases your flexibility. One key problem is that the cost is often more than people anticipate. This happens for several reasons. The first one is that most tenants often don't bother to estimate the cost. It's easy to get focused on other more immediate issues, and it's simply not a high priority to spend time estimating what it will cost to remove tenant improvements when the lease expires. But it's worthwhile to at least get a general idea of what it will cost to comply with the restoration clause. And when you learn what that cost is, it may inspire you to negotiate a bit harder to reduce some of those requirements. Another thing that can make restoration costlier than expected is if you add new improvements during your lease. It's not uncommon for tenants to make additions to their space, like additional private offices, conference rooms, or a larger kitchen. When that happens, it can potentially add the restoration cost because there's now more work required to restore the space to its original condition. If you find yourself in a difficult negotiation over restoration requirements, it can be helpful to separate market improvements from specialized improvements. You may recall from our previous discussion about tenant improvements that a market improvement is something that most tenants can utilize. For example, a kitchen, a private office, or a conference room. Those are things that most tenants need when they lease office space. Specialized TI is something that is specific to your company and would not necessarily be useful to other tenants. For example, a customized R&D room or an artistic structure in the middle of your space. Those are things that the next tenant who occupies the space won't need. The point here is that the landlord is more likely to forego a restoration obligation for what they consider a market improvement. The reason being that the next tenant might utilize that improvement, and therefore there's no point in having you tear it out when you leave. Not all landlords will agree with this, but it can be an effective way to find a middle ground if the landlord's insisting on an expensive restoration that you would like to avoid. Just to reiterate, I'm not suggesting that restoration obligations should always be negotiated. The important thing is to make sure you understand what is required and that you get a general idea of what that will cost. If you're okay with the cost, then you can focus on other deal terms, and if you're not, then you can negotiate to reduce it. The important part is to avoid being blindsided at the end of your lease.